Good morning. Welcome to episode 77 of Duval Rundown. My name is Gus Logue. Today, I'm joined, as I am every Tuesday, by Hays Carlyon of The Frangie Show. You can catch him and Frangie on 1010XL and 92.5 FM radio each weekday from 4 to 6 p.m. Hays was in Indianapolis last week for the NFL Combine, so we'll hear some thoughts from him at the end of today's show. But today we're going to hit on some potential trade down scenarios from the 5th overall pick that the Jaguars hold in the 2025 NFL draft, because one takeaway that we all had from last week, new Jaguars GM James Gladstone said that even though they lead the league in the amount of draft capital that they have, 24 picks over the next 2 seasons, they will be looking to add to that. And so I think they would certainly be interested in looking to trade down from number 5, especially since they don't need a quarterback, and there's a lot of quarterback needy teams in the NFL. So looking forward to this conversation. But Hays, welcome back to the show.
Good morning, Gus. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Glad you made it back safely from Indianapolis. Again,
Me too.
Again, we'll get some of your thoughts maybe at the end of the show. But Hays, when you're looking at different teams in the draft, when you're looking at the order of the first round, what stands out to you as one or two teams or one or two draft slots that stand out to you the most as a potential trade down scenario for the Jaguars?
Yeah, I think 7 is got a chance to be a real hot zone with the Jets, trying to get ahead of the Raiders. And so, that would be obviously a move that would, I think, benefit the Jaguars as well. It's not going to be a treasure trove of picks when you're just talking about a couple of spots going from 5 to 7. But I think if you're the Jaguars, you absolutely would do it. Like you said, James Gladstone is prioritizing as many at bats as possible, even though they've got 20 picks and this draft and the next one. Yeah, absolutely. You'd want to add to that if you feel like, you're really only giving up one guy, because the quarterback they don't care about. So let's say the Jets want to come up to 5 to get Shedeur Sanders, assuming Cam Ward's off the board. Well, I mean, if you're the Jaguars, you move down to 7, and yeah, there's a chance that one of the guys that you covet will go at 6 to the Raiders. But, who knows? They may go in a different direction. So it's worth the gamble. You're, like I said, you're not going to get crazy compensation, but to pick up, a 3rd round and a 4th round pick, this year, something like that, maybe you get, if they're really desperate, maybe you get like the next year's 2nd, nothing really in this draft, but maybe in next year's 2 to move up 2 spots. But so it wouldn't be anything that would be wild, but for the Jaguars, the risk is pretty minimal. I mean, there is a chance that somebody goes at 6 that you would covet, but my guess is in that range, the Jaguars will have a mix of guys that they feel good about, and it'll be worth it for them to pick up the 2 additional picks. That would give them 3 3rd rounders. I mean, that's pretty spectacular when you're looking at, building a new foundation of talent and bringing in 3 guys in the 3rd round, because they already have 2 picks in the 3rd round. Or they could be aggressive on day 2 and look to move, package some of those 3rd round picks to go back into the 2nd, or, maybe even on night 1, after you've made that trade, package some your 2nd and a 3rd to get back into the late 1st round. So it would give them a lot of options. What about you?
Yeah, I think the conversation definitely starts at 7, really 6 and 7. As you mentioned, and as a couple of commenters are pointing out, this scenario kind of only works based on how free agency shakes out, and then obviously how the first 4 picks shake out. In this scenario where the Jaguars would be trading back and another team would be trading up for a quarterback, you kind of need only one of Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders to go in the first 4 picks. And for that to happen, you need the Titans and or the Giants to sign a good veteran quarterback in free agency. I kind of expect the Browns to take a quarterback regardless, personally, just because I think Andrew Berry, their general manager, they're so analytics minded that I don't think they're going to waste the opportunity to take this valuable of a dart throw on a quarterback when they don't have a clear answer at quarterback. So I do think that the Browns are going to take a quarterback. But if the Titans and the Giants end up not taking a quarterback, and again, one of Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders is still on the board when the 5th overall pick comes up, then I think there would definitely be multiple teams calling Jacksonville interested in trading up for a quarterback, starting with, of course, the Jets at 7 and then the Raiders at 6. I think the Raiders deserve a shout, not just because they would be the team that would leapfrog the Jets, but I think that the Jags could also kind of try to create a bidding war and potentially even trade with just the Raiders down one spot if the Raiders like a quarterback enough to just move up one spot to ensure that they get the guy instead of the Jets. And as you were saying, I agree where this is kind of like would be the perfect scenario for the Jaguars because they would be able to trade down 1 or 2 spots, pick up probably somewhere, like you said, between a 2nd and a 3rd round pick, if not like a 3rd and a 4th or a 3rd and additional capital. But then they would still have a chance at getting a potentially franchise-altering offensive or defensive lineman because hypothetically, I mean, at this point after the NFL Combine, I think one of the biggest rumors that I've seen is that the Patriots are enthused with Mason Graham and are very interested in taking him with the 4th overall pick. But between Mason Graham, Will Campbell, and now Armand Bembou from Missouri has entered the conversation of just borderline elite prospects along the trenches. The Jaguars would still potentially or probably be able to get away with one of those guys with the 6th or 7th overall pick and then still be able to pick up the draft capital. And so, again, this does come down to how free agency and the quarterback market kind of shakes out in the first 4 picks. This is definitely a realistic scenario, I think. But beyond the Raiders at 6 or the Jets at 7, Hays, are there any other teams that stick out to you as potential options to trade down or be a trade partner with the Jags in the first round?
I think keep an eye on the Seahawks at 18. Now that would be going up, considerably. That would be a lot of payment that Seattle would have to be willing to make to Jacksonville. But I look at Seattle. I look at I see stagnation. I mean, Geno Smith. I mean, he's okay, but he's never going to take you to any great heights. And so I look at a team like Seattle with the 18th pick. Do they make a move? It's not a Julio Jones, Atlanta move where, you're going from mid-20s to, right outside the top 5. But 18 to 5 is certainly a considerable amount to move up the board. But I think it would make sense for Seattle to get a player like Shedeur Sanders in there, could learn from Geno Smith maybe for a year at most if he doesn't unseat him before then. But Seattle, to me, looks like a team that needs to kind of figure out what they are. I think they've sort of reached their ceiling of what they can be with Geno Smith. And I do think they have some talent there. So I think if you hit on the rookie quarterback, the Seattle could, elevate even more to being a contender in the NFC West. So would Seattle be willing to do that? They'd obviously, the 26th first rounder would be an absolute, has to be in the package. So if you're the Jaguars, you'd be picking up Seattle's 1st and 26. You're probably looking at, a 3rd rounder in addition to that this year. If Seattle, if Seattle didn't want to part with the 26th first rounder, I think the deal would be hard to do. But if you're the Jaguars, would taking Seattle's 2nd rounder in this draft, their 3rd rounder, and a 26th 2nd rounder, would that be enough? It might be enough. I think, though, if you're going to move back 13 spots on the board, that 26th first rounder has got to be part of the deal. But they're a team that I could see making a big move because I just think that they need to do something to really kind of elevate where they're going. They'd have to obviously really believe in Shedeur Sanders to make that kind of a move. And they may not feel that strongly about him, but if they do, if you're Seattle and you're going to wait at 18 for a quarterback, well, you don't really know what's going to – I mean, maybe you're looking at the 3rd guy off the board and Jackson Dart, that'd be my guess. But, you just don't know. So if you're looking for a wild card, to me, it would be Seattle coming up from 18.
I love that. You're great at throwing curveballs on this show, Hays. That was definitely one that I had not considered. And I am personally a big fan of both Geno Smith and their head coach, Mike McDonald. And so I would like to see where they could potentially go with Geno. But I totally hear your point, and I think it's a good one where they are kind of in no man's land a little bit, the Seahawks, where it's like they might end up reaching kind of a cap ceiling with Geno Smith. And so they kind of have to decide whether they want to risk kind of being the new age Steelers, where they're just always a mediocre team, but aren't quite bad enough to truly be able to kind of like rebuild into a contender, or if maybe they want to take a step back and move on from Geno Smith, get younger at the position. Coincidentally, I think Geno Smith is pretty popular player comp for Shedeur Sanders. But there's also been rumors out of Seattle from the combine of them potentially moving on from DK Metcalf. Specifically, there's a link to the Green Bay Packers there. And so it would be interesting if the Seahawks do end up deciding like this is a good time for us to actually go into the like youth movement, full on rebuild, and decide that this is the direction that we're taking rather than, again, hanging out in no man's land. So I really like that. And again, you mentioned the Julio Jones trade. That was trading up. The Falcons went from the 21st pick to the 6th pick. And I think they gave up 2 first-rounders, a second-rounder, and 2 fourth-rounders. And so, as you said, the Jaguars would definitely need the Seahawks' 2025 and 2026 first-round picks and then additional capital after that. And so I wonder – I mean, obviously James Gladstone and the Jaguars will be interested in general in trading down and accruing extra draft capital. But I do wonder if they'd be willing to trade down because the 2 teams that I kind of had in mind were very far down, both the Rams, where Gladstone came from, and we've seen Sean McVay and Les Snead be really aggressive with their first-round capital, both in terms of trading for veteran players. Then there was also a bunch of videos that came out after last year's draft about the Rams being interested in trading up from – they were like the 18th pick, I think, and they were interested in trading up into the top 10 for Brock Bowers. And that didn't happen, but they, again, are aggressive. And so potentially like they would have a long way to go from 26th pick in this year's draft. But I just think it would be a team to keep an eye on in terms of a long shot. And then the other one that I was thinking of was be the Vikings, 24th overall pick, so another long shot. But we saw the Vikings trade up with the Jaguars in the first round of last year's draft. Vikings went from the 23rd pick to the 17th pick. And then the Vikings also in last year's draft traded 2 second-round picks to get into the first round. And then they traded the 11th overall pick for the 10th overall pick to draft J.J. McCarthy. So Minnesota is another team that's been really aggressive in the first round.
Gus, do you see a prospect outside a quarterback that you think teams would want to come up for? Because I really don't see it, but in this hypothetical, could there – because obviously if you go beyond quarterback, then more teams, could want to come up to the party and trade up to the 5th pick. Right. Do you see guys there outside of the quarterback position? Do some of these guys excite you that you think maybe some other clubs would want to make a move up to get a non-quarterback?
Yeah, I think that Armand Membu would be really interesting because the other kind of class – so we talked about teams that are picking 18th, 24th, and 26th. Well, I also think there's a row of teams kind of in the early middle draft. New Orleans at 9, Chicago at 10, San Francisco at 11, Dallas at 12. I feel like all of those teams are sneaky options to make a big move. And I think that Armand Membu, the tackle from Missouri, he's arguably the biggest riser from Combine Week last week. He's like a 20-year-old prospect who has some technique to clean up, but like this could be like the next Trent Williams, the next Penei Sewell, just the next absolute freak in like the most, like the nicest way I'm trying to put it. But he's just a monster. And so I think especially like Ben Johnson having a new coaching regime in Chicago, Ryan Poles, I feel like likes the idea of making a big move. Maybe they like try to get Ben Johnson's new Penei Sewell. San Francisco, maybe they try to get the heir to Trent Williams since he's getting up there in age. I think that Travis Hunter and Abdul Carter are definitely at the top of the class in terms of non-quarterbacks. But I also am assuming that they're going to be gone in the top 3 picks. But then beyond 3, like I think that if there's going to be a prospect that a team trades up for at the 5th overall pick that's not a quarterback, then my guess would be Armand Membu. But
nice.
Yeah.
What? Tell me about the Oregon defensive tackle that is starting to get some buzz. I saw Frisco mocked him, I think, 5th to the Jags.
Yeah, his name is Derek Harmon. I don't know a lot about him. I think he's got like prototypical great size, and so he can obviously immediately be kind of like a pro-ready prospect. But I think that I don't know. I think there's a lot of defensive tackle prospects that are kind of being bumped up a lot. Like even Mason Graham, I think is a great prospect, but I don't know if he's. I don't view him as like a surefire top 5 guy. Walter Nolan is another guy, and Kenneth Grant, Walter Nolan from Ole Miss and Kenneth Grant from Michigan are 2 prospects that, again, I think are like great prospects, but I think they're more of round 2 guys than round 1 guys. And same goes for Derek Harmon. I would love for the Jaguars to have any of those guys, but I don't know. I feel like the position is getting bumped up a little bit. I think both with that and with the edge class, like it's 2 strong and deep groups along the defensive line, both the interior and the edge. But I think that really because of the Super Bowl, because of recency bias, a lot of teams are saying, how can we be this year's Eagles? And there's going to be a lot of investments in the trenches, including interior defensive line. And so I like Derek Harmon, and I think he'd be an interesting second-round pick for the Jaguars at 36 overall. But I would be shocked if he was picked 5th overall or 9th overall or really anywhere in the first round.
Do you like Tetero McMillan, the Arizona receiver? Because we're seeing, some buzz about that he is maybe falling back a little bit. Obviously, he didn't work out in Indy, and surprisingly said he's not going to run it as pro day either. We'll see if he changes his mind about that, because I think that's a mistake. But if you're the Jaguars in this conversation of trading back, what kind of player do you think they'd be looking for if they were to move? 5 to 7 probably doesn't greatly change things, but let's say they move out of the top 10. Could Tetero McMillan, if he's on the board at 12, at 15, at 18, A, do you think that's a reality? Could that happen? And B, do you like the fit with the Jaguars if he's there?
Yeah, I definitely like the fit. I mean, they'd be kind of making their own Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, and then they would potentially run into that same problem that the Bengals have of like, if Brian Thomas and Ted McMillan, I mean, obviously Brian Thomas has been working out extremely well, but if they both go on to be Pro Bowl or All-Pro receivers and you have to pay both of them in addition to Trevor Lawrence, it kind of makes more sense with the team building that they're in, the team building phase, to have Brian Thomas on the rookie contract and to have Christian Kirk or someone else as like more expensive on a veteran deal. But I'm sure he would be a fit in the offense. I think that Trevor hasn't really had his weapons in general haven't been great in college, but I think he's also been specifically missing a big-bodied contested catch receiver, because I think that Trevor is not like one of the most accurate quarterbacks in the league, but I think he is really good at ball placement in terms of putting balls where the receivers can get it and where the cornerbacks can't get it. And then also he does a great job of protecting his receivers, I think, and not putting them in harm's way and routes like over the middle of the field. And so I think that Trevor, again, isn't like Joe Burrow where he's pinpoint accurate and is always putting it on the money every single throw. But generally his ball placement is really good. He knows where he should be putting the ball. And so he needs like the kind of guy that's just going to be a good match on the receiving side of that. And so I think he'd be a great fit with Trevor. I'm sure he'd be a good fit with Liam, since Liam is so good at kind of like scheming around his players versus having his players get molded into his scheme. But I think Tet would be a consideration if he was still there at like say the 18th pick, and if the Jaguars happen to hold that pick. But I think that if the Jaguars traded back to 6th pick or the 7th pick or even the 9th or the 10th pick, I think that they're pretty determined to boost their trenches. And I think that messaging has been really clear from what we've heard from their football leadership unit. But I also think that they're going to make sure that their actions are as loud as their words, and that they're going to take a trench player and a tone-setting trench player that matches their tough philosophy that they've been preaching. I think that that's what they really want. And so, again, I think best case scenario for them is probably going back to 7, picking up extra draft capital, and still being able to get one of those franchise-changing big men.
If they took Will Campbell, how do you think they would play the offensive line next year?
I think he would immediately slot in as the starting right guard, and then they just kind of go from there. Walker Little and Anton Harrison are not only projected to be the starting offensive tackles in 2025, but they're under contract for several more years after that. And so it is interesting if you like kind of create a position battle. Competition is good, but then if Will Campbell does like beat out Walker Little, say for the left tackle job, all of a sudden like what are you doing exactly with Walker Little? The take that I have about the offensive lineman is that I think that Armand Membu, who I mentioned earlier, is the best offensive lineman prospect in the draft. But I think that Will Campbell might be the better fit because I think that not that Armand is like a conservative or shy football player, but Will Campbell definitely shows the grit and tenacity that the Jaguars' new regime is looking for. And I think that he's probably better suited to play guard or tackle. Like I think that Membu could play guard, but like he seems like just a surefire long-term blindside protector, or at least offensive tackle along the edge. And I think Campbell is more so kind of versatile, where you can move him along the offensive line, both from tackle to guard, but then also switching sides. So I also think that Will Campbell is a little bit more of a pro-ready prospect, where I expect Membu to have the better career, but he's got a little bit more technical work to clean up, especially in year one. And so I think that Will Campbell can, like, again, immediately be slotted in as the right guard, give the Jaguars really good value at that position as a rookie, and then kind of just see what happens in the future, where if you have too many offensive linemen, then that's kind of a good problem to have. And potentially he'll be a long-term offensive tackle for the Jaguars, and potentially he'll just start at right guard as a rookie and hopefully maybe be a multiple Pro Bowler at that position and retire with his jersey being hung up in the rafters of the Jaguars stadium. And so, again, I really like Membu. I think that he's the best offensive line prospect in the draft, but I do think Will Campbell makes a ton of sense as a fit specifically with the Jags.
And that's sort of where I come back to is, if that's the scenario, and I agree with you, I think that would be the scenario, though, whoever they take it, let's say they go offensive lineman with the first, but let's just say they stay at 5 and take an offensive lineman, whether it's Campbell or Membu. To me, they're probably playing guard their first year. And to me, that's wildly overpaying for a right guard. When you've got a high second-round pick, you've got 2 third-round picks, so I'll be interested in seeing, and that may be the path they take. And again, when it comes to protecting Trevor Lawrence, they may say, hey, it doesn't matter where we're taking these guys. We just need to set the dish, as James Gladstone says, and make sure Trevor can step into throws. But to me, if you're going to take a tackle and put him at guard, I think you'd be better off waiting either high second-round pick, which is basically going to be one of the top 2 guards probably on the board, somebody that's always played guard, or, wait until the 3rd round with one of those 2 picks to take a right guard. I think you're probably, assuming you've done your evaluation correctly, you should be getting at least a decent year 1 starter, if not a good player there. So that's where I keep coming back that's why I think, again, that's why I tend to tilt towards, if he's there, I think the pick will be Mason Graham, because I just don't know how, as you start to build this, you can go guard at 5, which is what the player would really be. Assuming I can come around more on it if they're going to take a tackle at 5, but play him at left tackle, and Walker Little or Anton Harrison is going to kick inside. But I'm with you. I don't get a sense that that's where they're at.
Yeah, and like I totally agree with you, where I even said on yesterday's show pretty much the same point, where like for an interior offensive lineman, like you don't need to address that position in the first round. There's plenty of good talent in day 2 and even the beginning of day 3, and you can take a couple of dart throws. But I just to play devil's advocate, I think the thing that would make taking, even if Will Campbell, which I don't think he is, like only going to be a guard, but even if they said like we're comfortable with Will Campbell only playing guard throughout his entire career, like it's not that they're just trying to fix one position. Mitch Morse, I think played pretty well last year, but he's obviously getting pretty close to retirement just with his age. Ezra Cleveland, again, I'm personally a fan of Ezra, but I don't know like what the new regime thinks of him. And so
Right.
again, if the team if it was like Trent Baalke still making the picks, then like the whole offensive line is like guys that he built, and so he would only be needing to fix one position, and that would be right guard, and he can do that either with a cheap free agency option or like a mid to late round draft pick. But because it's a new regime, and because you have not just guys like Ezra who are like you don't know what the regime thinks of them, but also Mitch Morse, where you objectively still like need a contingency plan for him once he eventually does move on from the team in what's probably going to be the next year or two. You're going to have to take multiple dart throws at the offensive line. And because Liam Cohen and James Gladstone and Tony Baselli have all said it's so important to them, I see them taking multiple dart throws, and I think that one of those dart throws could be included in a top 5 pick, even if it is someone who will maybe probably only play offensive guard. But again, I do agree with you. I think that that's kind of part of the other reason that I like Membu more in general. But again, Campbell is just, I think, a better, especially short-term fit for the Jaguars. But I'll throw a hypothetical at you. If I feel like, so we've come down to the Jets and the Seahawks being two of the most interesting potential trade options. And they also have two potentially interesting, assuming they are actually available, options at wide receiver for Garrett Wilson for the Jets, who last season requested a trade because I think he was very tired of playing with Aaron Rodgers. Now Rodgers isn't going to be a Jet, and so I'd assume that New York would love to keep Garrett Wilson, and I assume that he will end up being there. But maybe Garrett Wilson still wants to move on. DK Metcalf, we mentioned earlier with the Seahawks, he's been a part of some trade rumors. And so, Hays, the hypothetical for you, if you're trading with one of these teams, would you rather get the 7th overall pick? Would you rather trade the 5th overall pick for the 7th overall pick and Garrett Wilson, or for the 18th overall pick and DK Metcalf and next year's first-round pick from the Seahawks?
I would take DK Metcalf. I think his game is extraordinary. I think playing in Seattle, he's a little underrated. He's such an incredibly gifted athlete and has really come into his own as a receiver. And he is somebody that I think with Trevor Lawrence and Brian Thomas Jr. on the other side, I mean, he's somebody that I think can put up 1,300 yards and 12 touchdowns. I think he's still relatively young. It feels like he's been in the league for a long time, but he entered the league very young. So you're talking about a guy that's still just in his mid-20s, should have 5-6 great years of football left. I would love to see the Jaguars acquire DK Metcalf. And particularly for, if that compensation is also part of it, again, like you said, you'd have to pay him. So you're releasing Christian Kirk to bring in DK Metcalf, to offset that. But I think DK Metcalf is somebody that would be a superstar in Jacksonville. I mean, I think he is one of the most underrated players in the league. So I'd love to see it. He's such a tough cover because of his size and his speed. And I mean, I think he can take over games. I think Seattle is really done, particularly this last year. I think they really struggled getting him the ball, but he's somebody I think absolutely has his best football still ahead of him.
And he would definitely be someone that would be a perfect fit with Liam Cohen and like next to Brian Thomas, but then specifically with Trevor Lawrence, going back to having a big bodied contested catch guy. But obviously he can take the top off of any kind of defense. So having that kind of vertical element paired with Brian Thomas would definitely be exciting. I think I would personally choose Garrett Wilson, honestly, because I'm definitely a fan of DK, but I'm an even bigger fan of Garrett. I think that even if he's a little bit less of like a perfect fit in terms of body type in Jacksonville, I just love the player so much. And if you're trading back to 7th, then you still potentially get that franchise-altering trench player as well. But either scenario, I think, would be super interesting. I think that whole conversation was really interesting and fun to go through. Hays, do you have any kind of lingering thoughts or questions or potential trades you want to throw out there?
No, I think we covered it. That was a lot of fun.
Sweet. All right. Well, Hayes, before you go, any lingering thoughts or anything from Combine Week last week? Big takeaways, lingering questions you have, or are you just?
I think it's again. I think it's an exciting draft. I think the defensive line being as deep as it is, the running back position being as deep as it is, I think is exciting to see. And it's the quarterback is just not a very strong class. So will teams get desperate? Will they overdraft these guys? Maybe even more so than what we're used to seeing. That'll be interesting to see how it unfolds. But I come out of Indianapolis thinking the Jaguars are in great shape. If I don't think Travis Hunter falls to 5, but if he does, that's a slam dunk decision. You write his name on the card, you do cartwheels up to the podium to turn in the card for Travis Hunter. If Mason Graham is there, fantastic. You've anchored your defensive front. You've created some of that interior pass rush that they've been sorely lacking. And if they really want to go bold and take T-Mac out of Arizona, I don't believe that'll happen because of what you're saying. They've just been so at the forefront of wanting to build up the trenches. But I don't see offensive linemen really in play at 5 for the reasons that we discussed. And if they wanted to take Tetero McMillan and pair him with Brian Thomas Jr. with the thinking of, we're not going to be back here again. We're not going to be in the top. We're not going to be in a position to draft the best receiver in the draft, very often. That's your hope moving forward. So do they go ahead and say, yeah, down the road, we're going to have a financial issue when we got to pay both these guys? Because obviously BTJ looks like he's well on his way to playing 2 more years and then getting a monster extension. But at least for the present, you've got BTJ on a very relatively cheap contract for 2 more seasons at a minimum. And you've got Tetero McMillan going into year 1 of a 4-year deal in which he's fairly inexpensive compared to the big paid receivers in the league. So, that would be exciting. And then in the second round, you can address defensive tackle or interior offensive line. And then you've got those 2 third-round picks that you can continue to build the trenches. So I think they could make a pick at receiver at 5 if it's a guy they love and still fill some good needs along both fronts, particularly if they go and sign, let's say they go sign a starting guard in free agency, then again, that makes it a little bit easier. So, I think, my takeaway really is I think the Jags are in a good spot. And if they do get calls, then I think they're well equipped to move down and pick up some extra ammunition and still get a very good prospect.
Now, if they do end up passing on Tet in the first round, are there any later round receivers that you're keeping your eye on and that you like?
I like the Ole Miss kid, Harris. He battled an injury last year. He tried to come. He came back for the Florida game, made a couple incredible plays, and then re-injured it. But he's somebody that I think is going to have a better pro career than he had collegiate career. So, yeah, if it's Mason Graham at 5 and they want to go receiver, I think he's probably going to be there in that early second round. I think that would be a selection that would make a lot of sense. And then again, with your 2 third-round picks, okay, now you can go and take advantage of that deep defensive line group and maybe go get an edge and a tackle in the 3rd round. I think that would pair well, with that kind of a mix. So a lot of exciting directions that they could potentially go in.
Absolutely. Well, that's why we're here, to go through all the different scenarios that could happen. So appreciate everyone for tuning in. Hayes, appreciate you as always. We'll see you here.
Thank you, Gus.
Yeah. We'll be back here at 9:04 a.m. tomorrow talking about new Jaguars defensive coordinator Anthony Campanile from the Green Bay Packers. See you all then. Thanks, everyone. Take care.